Hello, good evening, and welcome to the 45th edition of Libero, the podcast that's about the least important of the most important things. As I think Ian McShane once said. Now, was it on Lovejoy or was it on Dallas? I can't remember. Anyway, quick reminder before we start, one that helps us out here. Ratings on Spotify and Apple would be very helpful. Good ratings are especially helpful to particularly. At the moment, we're doing well in the charts, but as an independent, we're still challenging the big guns. So we're sort of in that process of the old indie charts where someone like Ride or the Wonder Stuff, we're just outside the top 10. So unless we do a collaboration with Vic Reeves and Bob Mortimer, we're probably not going to get to the top. But you can help us get there by nice ratings and good reviews and telling your friends and all that stuff. Now, joining us on the line today, I've got Miguel Delaney of The Independent and Tariq Panja of the New York Times. We are talking after the opening weekend of the Premier League. It's just been and gone. It's fair to say, Miguel, you and I were not at the best games of the weekend. I was at Brighton v Fulham. A lot of running around.
Yeah.
A lot of pressing. A lot of pressing work's gone in over the summer, it would appear. And Brighton denied by late Fulham goal. A lot of transfer talk. Carlos Baleba looked very good. Worth every penny of the 120 million or whatever that Manchester United are not going to buy him for because he's not for sale. And I was very pleased to see Josh King play well for Fulham, mostly because I tipped him in the Guardian preview. But yeah, there's a player to look out for. How about you, Miguel? At Chelsea, bit of a grind that game, you know?
Not great. I mean, from a journalist perspective, it actually wasn't too bad because I could just write about the Eze situation. I mean, that's what we're kind of looking for. But I mean, that was needed in terms of a writer's job of the day because there was so little to say about the match itself. And of course, my day was framed by the night before. I'd written at about 8 p.m. as everyone, I was like, it looked like the Eze transfer was going to happen. I wrote about 8 p.m. that it run into difficulties. And as of Monday afternoon, the two clubs haven't even agreed a payment structure. This did not go down well with Tottenham fans on Saturday night. Gee, I had quite a 12 hours. And then I had the other side from Palace fans, as well as pissing off Newcastle fans for mentioning Saudi Arabia on the Sunday supplement.
How dare you?
But yeah. I mean, that's my weekend separate. I mean, there was 4 or 5 really good Premier League games from mostly watching the highlights or being stuck in front of the TV all day Saturday.
But we just weren't there. Yeah. I mean, the other one that I saw, of course, was Aston Villa against Newcastle, including those interesting coloured shirts. Why Newcastle didn't play in black and white against a team in claret and blue, well, we can only speculate. Tariq, any observations from that opening weekend?
I thought Newcastle were missing a striker, lads.
Yes.
I watched, looking at that game as well. Chelsea as well, bizarrely. Miguel, you were there.
Yeah.
They seem to have bought all of these attacking players. And obviously, Chelsea, I should say, the world champions Chelsea.
Yes.
I saw that emblazoned on the back of that hotel behind one of the goals. Really flat in terms of attack. They were sort of getting up to the areas you want them to get up to, and then nothing happening.
They always feel like a slightly weirdly put together team. Sorry, in this iteration they do. Like if you compare one of their last title wins in 14-15, say, or 16-17 with Conte, where you had 2 title winners that just every position made sense in terms of where they were. With this, there's always a sense, and maybe this is down to like the constant incremental improvement in the players they've got, where you can sort of see the shape, but it doesn't necessarily fit together all that well. There's even been an element of kind of Cole Palmer, brilliant as he's been for most of Maresca's time, in that he's been moved maybe away from where he's at his most effective. And of course, then you've got, as you say, the individual creativity of a lot of these players sometimes feels like it jars a little with Maresca's exact approach. And to me, Maresca's obviously a good coach, but to me, if you're talking about Chelsea's potential title challengers, I mean, he's not in the same league as Guardiola, obviously, or Slot, or to be honest, I'd say Arteta either. And I think that's an
Do you
issue.
know, do you know what I found strange, or a little bit back to the end of last season? And Chelsea fans hammered me when I last spoke about them. So here we go. Cole Palmer, towards the end of last season, he seemed to kind of disappear a bit because he had such a fantastic start to the season last year, and then come towards the last 2-3 months of the season, his output dwindled, and then he had that incredible performance throughout the Club World Cup. And you thought, okay, they figured out what to do with him again. He just
No
looked like,
competition.
yeah, not a real competition. There you go.
You
He,
really
he,
go
he,
for these Chelsea fans, you two lads, aren't you? Yeah. Um,
he looked like the same problems of last season seemed to appear again. I know it's just one game in. What's happened there? What were you were watching? You were watching the game. What did you think?
let me put preface my theory, Miguel. See what you think about it. I think Cole Palmer isn't a number 10, and he's
Yeah.
a better player coming off the flank with a bit of space to work with, and that's where you'll see the best of him, and maybe a bit of a freer role than just that rigid. Yeah, can you have a rigid number 10? Well, Enzo Maresca can certainly make it that way.
But in fairness to Chelsea as well, and Maresca did say this afterwards. I mean, they've had a weird pre-season because of that Club World Cup, and that is going to have an effect this season. And I think that's why they did look a bit undercooked yesterday. Also, we shouldn't forget the other side of this, in that Palace are like basically like there's always that one team in the Premier League who the wealthiest clubs or the big six, as a topic that we're going to get into today a bit, that they hate to play against. And it was Stoke, it became Brentford, all for different reasons. I'd say I'm not saying Palace have the same approach. When it's now Palace who are that now, I think they're better than any of those. I mean, look at their recent record. What? It's 3 defeats in 25 games in 2025. Something like their last 10 games have involved 7 games either away or at Wembley against the old Big Six, and one against Villa, and they're unbeaten. They're so well organised. I mean, they give you such problems in attack because they've got some really exciting attackers. One of the biggest being Eze, who they might unfortunately lose this week, or at some point before the end of the window. But I mean, it's supposed to be fair to them with the way they've gone. And I heard they do want to bring 2 players, one being El Canoes from Leicester, and one other option from Belgium. One of them being unknown at this time of speaking, apparently, because I know the name of the others out there. And like you would have faith in them actually to regenerate if they don't lose too many players. And again, this is going to touch on the topic we talk about today. If they don't lose too many players, hopefully they can sustain what they are. Because I mean, like it's quite nice having that at the very just this upward mobile club who generally, I mean, you can have questions say about the idea of the kind of the type of capitalist owning the club, but generally they've gone about things the right way, and it's a fairly self-sustainable organic club that's kind of made great use of their catchment area in South London as well.
I suppose 2 things to say that. How long until Chelsea want Oliver Glasner as manager? And secondly, and we must notice, of course, that the Donald Trump scarf was a must-have item amongst the swaggers selling at Stamford Bridge there. If you saw that, Donald Trump, the big Chelsea guy, as we know. Yeah, so there we go.
True blues, Mourinho used to say.
Blues, there we go. Right, okay. So after all that excitement, we're going to go for perhaps, well, one of the most emotive subjects in football, yet also the driest. At times, it's as dry as a discarded sandal in the Sahara. Let's put it that way. But there's a lot of discussion over this subject, and it is, of course, PSR. Profit and sustainability. FFP, it used to be called, which is the same thing. We'll get into the differences there. Miguel, you actually wrote a book on this. So, tell me, why and what is PSR?
I mean, it is at its core really just a financial control. That is it. It's an attempt to anchor spending to income, with that coming from the idea that debt shouldn't get out of control and football clubs should be sustainable. Now, this has obviously become one of the biggest debates in football, precisely because you have a tranche of owners who want to pump in a lot more money for a lot of reasons that aren't necessarily related to football, but obviously having a winning football team is part of it. and would prefer if these rules were at the very least loosened. So it has become one of the biggest debates in the game. But yeah, and that's really all it is, a financial control where spending is linked to income, and you're only allowed, or sorry, owners are only allowed to put in a certain amount of money. In the Premier League, it's actually more than in Europe, or has been more than Europe. Europe's rules have actually become, or UEFA's rules have become more involved over the past few years, and the Premier League has actually had some difficulty there in updating their own. Now, of course, one of the issues that this has had and why it's provoking such debate is because it sits in this system where I think there is, for all the debate about it, and for all I do come down on one side of the debate, which we'll get into, there is a fair counter argument that FFP or PSR, as it currently stands, at least has the potential to freeze the current system in place, where there's a tranche of super clubs who already kind of try and push for most of the game's income to go their way. If the game is based on or how much income you take in, that it can lock football in play. But I think that's a separate debate, the PSR, and one we can get into. But yeah, I'd say the reason that we're talking about it all the time is obviously because, I mean, to be fair, principally clubs like Newcastle, because we do know a lot of the debate about it is pushed from that end and has been pushed from within the club. Amanda Staveley even brought it up a lot before she left the club. They want to be able to spend more. It's Villa have started to talk about it a fair bit as well. Obviously, the entire Manchester City case, they insist on their innocence. That is ultimately about old FFP rules. And yeah, it's, as you say, it is one of the biggest debates in football now. One of the most emotive topics.
Tariq, I'm not sure you've written the book on it, but you've written an awful lot about it over the years. Anything to add there to Miguel's summation?
No, I think that's exactly the lie of the land, as it were, and Miguel is right as well. Is this? There's a separate debate about a competitive balance linked to PSR, because obviously, if you are the richest team and you do have PSR, there is a risk of stratification, isn't there? I.e., the more money you have to spend, the better players you get to have, and if you fail, you can get more. Whereas another team might try, and if they fail, they're off the cliff, or they can't try again, and they say, well, hang on, we're going to be stuck in this situation. I mean, part of the issue is the rules, the lack of transparency over these cases. Now,
yes,
in the Premier League, what have we seen? We've seen cases involving Aston Villa or not. We've seen Everton. We've seen Nottingham Forest. We've seen other clubs saying, oh, we are close to having PSR jeopardy. Manchester United putting a statement out, I think, at one point. But we don't know what that looks like. What we have are rumours around PSR breaches. We have cases that are opened by the Premier League, but no visibility over these cases. And then suddenly an announcement of a case being brought, and then maybe a 50 to 100-page document sort of landing, and then us sort of scrambling to decipher what this is. The Premier League is not helping itself with its communication strategy around this stuff. It just doesn't want to say anything. It doesn't say anything. Creates a vacuum, and then it gets filled by a lot of nonsense half the time.
And on that point, exactly, like, we had our annual pre-season briefing or kind of audience with Richard Masters, the Premier League chief executive, on Thursday just before it started. And I actually asked him, like, do you feel under siege about PSR? Because it does feel like the entire discussion is driven by agitators who want to get rid of it. Of course, something that overlooks the fact that PSR is in place because the 14 clubs voted into place. This is the reason for everything in the Premier League. Nothing is imposed upon it. The clubs agree to it. And I think that's why there is a certain lack of transparency. And like, this is really a debate from their podcast. But like the Premier League, it basically has, because of its massive size, it has more effect than anything else in football, really, especially in the domestic game. But it really has no interest in actually kind of, acknowledging that effect in the rest of the game. Because all of its decisions are made for the Premier League alone, and are usually made because of the self-interest of the various clubs. And that self-interest is what has driven so much of this discussion. And I think, as again, a point worth stating, as dry as it is as a topic, it is something. It explains what we see in the pitch because it obviously conditions who can play on the pitch, and that obviously leads into some of the maybe less dry elements of the chat, like all sorts of talk of red cartels and and all of this.
Well, yeah, I mean, there is a significant amount of conspiracy theories about this. One of the things that, I mean, funny enough, as a football fan, as a football journalist in the last 25, 30 years, we've had to learn an awful lot about business practices. Like the Glazer family taught us what a leveraged buyout was. I'm not sure as many people knew what one of those was before that happened. And a lot of us are doing it on the fly. But one of the things I have learned, and I did study accountancy many years ago, is that certain accounts can look different according to the accountant. And another thing is that there is almost a cottage industry of experts, some inverted commas, some not, who are throwing around stuff, and their words are hung on by interested parties in this. And one of the things you mentioned there, Miguel, is there is something of an alliance between certain clubs over this. The Aston Villa and Newcastle appears to be one. Now, Aston Villa, we mentioned, supposedly have gone close to PSR. Their spending this summer has been, negligible because they can't spend anyone. A reminder, they're owned by V Sports, a company jointly owned by Nassif Suarez and Wes Edens, he's an American, with a minority stake held by Tyros. It's an Egyptian billionaire and an American billionaire there. And they took Villa to heights they hadn't been at for 30 years or so. And then they've had to stop because the money has run out. They've bridged over the limits. And if you're an Aston Villa fan and you've had all this fun, you played Bayern Munich last season, you're saying, why's our fun got to stop? Someone else has ruled this. What's going on? Why can't we continue to grow as we'd like?
Yeah, that I think every football fan, doesn't matter which team you support, it is your escape, isn't it? It's away from whatever your work is or whatever issues you have. Football is that kind of fantasy moment, and if you're an Aston Villa supporter, those are the questions. But the point of these rules, however dry they are, one day Mr. Soares or Wes Edens might say, you know what, I don't fancy this anymore, and leave them completely on the hook for a future where Aston Villa might not exist anymore. If you just allow people to spend, build up losses and costs, and someone's going to have to pay for that in the end. And if these guys decide to walk away, because at the end of the day, these guys are business people. Like what we're seeing in the Premier League at the moment, we've got a class really of American businessmen or investors. Some of them are there to have fun and to enjoy owning these teams, but they didn't get rich or where they are by running a bunch of businesses that lost all of their money. They're hoping to probably sell these football teams in the future. And this is where we're going to come to a conversation maybe about what is a football team. Because at the moment, we keep treating all of these teams as a business. And that's what we're talking about PSR, we're talking about finances, we're talking about leverage buy investments, but we've stopped talking about what the point of a football team is. These guys have come in and seen assets that are rising. They've seen assets that are scarce. The league is the biggest league in the world. They're comparing that to, say, buying an NFL team, and compared to those, these Premier League teams are cheap. And one day they're going to want to flog these and then move on. That's how they are rich people, presumably. And you mentioned these Aston Villa owners. They give us another example of what's happened to the Premier League as a result of the types of owners and the types of rules. Hotels, women's football teams being sold to them. Chelsea under Todd Bowley and co were perhaps the pioneers of this new type of financial engineering. They come from that background. Bowley and Mark Walter, the guy who dropped, was it 10 billion on the LA Lakers from Guggenheim Partners. Their whole methodology, the way they got rich, is by engineering finances, moving money from here to there, and then getting paper profits. The Chelsea guys sold a women's football team to themselves for huge, for a crazy valuation. compared to the revenue. And the Aston Villa guys looked at that and thought, okay, we can do this. And they can do that. That is within the rules. But I just think what's going on here with the rules, where you have to do all this stuff. It's like Manchester City, I guess, slicing and dicing almost every company that exists in Abu Dhabi to sponsor their football club. That is also a part of this equation. And when they were devising these rules, I just think they were not ready. The Premier League, Kevin Plum, the senior lawyer there, and his team, and the financial guys, these are football lawyers, and people have come. They could never have bargained for the type of owners that they are now up against, the heavyweight financial bros, the state ownership, and the wealth of lawyers and financial acumen that can buy. I just think we're in a real mess, and this is the conversation right now.
On that as well, like, I mean, so one of the most common arguments you hear there, and I already feel like, to be honest, a lot of this podcast, for me at least, is going to be mentioning lines I've heard about all this and my fervent response to them. So you hear, one of them is like, what other business wouldn't allow owners or investors to put money in? Well, I mean, football isn't just a business. It's a sport that requires regulation, competitive balance. Competitive balance doesn't happen organically, and also involves social institutions. And the point you made there about Villa as well, Tariq, I mean, one of the ones you hear about that is that, what about a system where kind of owners can put a certain amount of money in escrow and all this? But one of the key points to that is, if you build, no matter about money in escrow or the kind of system while you can pay it, if you build a club or kind of an entity where it's based on a certain level of finance, and suddenly the owners, for whatever reason, leave, and it can happen for all sorts of reasons, then that club faces immediate existential risk. And this is the reason the rules are brought in the first place. I mean, like, all this stuff about kind of preserving the elite, it's nonsense. I mean, I think it is actually worth asserting this, because this actually is in the book. I will be succinct, or try to be, sorry. But like, so one of the aspects you always hear about FFP or PSR is, well, why don't they just have a salary cap instead? Well, actually, the entire genesis of PSR is that they tried to bring a salary cap in 1999. Now, UEFA quickly found that because they were so frightened of debt, and because the club being close to £1 billion in debt, and of course, you mentioned Villa there as well, John. Villa, like, what was it? The estimation last season, what they were spending over 90% of revenue and wages, and of course, it should be pointed out, wages aren't investment; they're consumption. But yeah, one of the entire points was to try and kind of make football sustainable, to ensure transfer installments are paid on time, to ensure wages are paid on time. But our salary cap was against EU law, so UEFA had to basically go off and try and come up with a way to almost recreate the effect of a salary cap, but in a different way. First of all, I had to come up with a legal framework. That was basically all the club licensing rules, which actually led to very good things like that. To play in European football, you had to meet, a certain amount of stadium criteria. You had to have certain positions in clubs, like fan liaison officers. And this evolved to a point where, obviously, they wanted to link expenditure to income. Now, there was a second step here where Platini, UEFA president, when FFP was installed, basically saw that French and German clubs had much stricter regulation than any other European counterparts, which led to a disadvantage. But also, given what exactly we're talking about, this sort of legal framework and trying to put all this system in place, that sort of stringent regulation makes sense. So the whole thing, FFP, was basically a way to recreate a football version of France's Direction Nationale du Contrôle de Gestion. I hope I've pronounced
Very well done.
Correctly, thank you. And also, another thing about that is, everyone always looks at this in the context of the biggest clubs and what, like, Newcastle's owners can spend. Whereas there's a responsibility to the rest of the game, because we just know from the pre-FFP world that clubs, if they have the chance, owners, if they have the chance, they will just spend, and they'll spend on wages. Now, that, even before FFP came in, that brought clubs like Leeds and Valencia to the brink, major regions where the rules were introduced. But also, that inflation, if there's no control, it does have this kind of chain reaction all the way down. And I know from people who've been in the meetings that set up FFP, a primary consideration was that clubs like Shelbourne in Ireland, suddenly, like, they couldn't pay players for Christmas, who had young kids. I mean, I know that's kind of tugging on the heartstrings, but this is the reality of it. This is the reality of why these rules are in place. And again, as someone involved put to me, like to go from like Platini's initial urge, stemming losses and ensuring bills are paid on time are perfectly sensible aims. The other side of that, of course, is the system it fits in, where I think is a different debate, and isn't actually a debate around PSR at all. Sorry.
I mean, at the moment, Sheffield Wednesday are a club who, 10 years ago, when Chansiri, who's part of this big Thai family that tuna billionaires that John West tuna, I think, is one of their products. That they thought, right, this is our golden ticket. Well, it didn't turn out that way. Remember back in Italy, back in the Signor Cragnotti at Lazio. They spent all that money. The guy at Parmalat, was it the price of produce went up when these clubs were spending money on big money on players, and eventually Syria collapsed, didn't
Parma's
it?
a good one. Parma's a great example because Parmalat was one of the biggest frauds in commercial history. So when Parmalat collapsed, effectively the football team, as we know, collapsed. So again, if you can't run on self-sustainable lines, it depends what you want as a fan as well. Look, if you want a thrill in the idea that your club could disappear, then crack on. But that is what we're talking about.
Yes.
And when we're talking about the pyramid and having this industry or this it's not even industry, this sport that we love for 100 years.
Yeah,
this is the point of it.
I mean, I speak as I'm a Macclesfield Town fan. Yes, was. Macclesfield Town went out of business. Now there is a replacement club there. There's a Phoenix club there, Macclesfield FC. But that feeling when there wasn't a club, and it was for a few weeks, few months, was utterly devastating for the fact that what had given me a lot of pleasure over the years had gone. What had given my family a big pleasure over the years had gone, and it ripped out a community asset. And this is one of the things about football finance, as emotive and as divisive a subject as it is. It should protect the community that is, and as part of it, which is the biggest part of football clubs, isn't it, really, or should be?
As soon as you loosen the rules, and okay, there might be an argument to loosen them a bit more, but the more you do that, the more you're basically anchoring football onto the idea of who your owner is. That's not what it's about, especially in a world where owners are private equity funds or sovereign wealth funds. And also, the more money that you can pump in that from these sort of ownerships, there's going to be more of a stretch, and the harder it is actually for everyone to catch up with these entities. And of course, and that's where the wage inflation comes in that causes such chaos.
Because of all these rules, I think now one of the biggest signings clubs can make now is the person or the people that can get them around financial fair play, and that is ridiculous. I've got quite a couple of examples, or a good example actually, was when Michel Platini's UEFA bought financial fair play in 2008. That was around the time Manchester City was purchased by Sheikh Mansour bin Zayed Al Nahyan as a personal purchase. It was not a state purchase, as we're told. UEFA had been advised by, I think, Deloitte, the accountancy firm, around setting financial fair play up. 2 signings Manchester City made were a couple of people, ex-Deloitte guys, who helped UEFA create the financial fair play structure. And then years and years later, we've seen where we are with all of this. I used to speak to a guy at the DNCG, which Miguel described very well and pronounced extremely well. Well done, Miguel, again on that. He went to PSG. So you're basically, and you see this where regulators in other industries join, I don't know, investment banks and things like that. We're seeing that in football as well. And you think, is that the game that you want? And in terms of the regulations, I just don't think they should be so complicated. That's part of it as well, where you are doing all of this financial chicanery. And the Premier League setup, as we talked about, is the teams or the person in the chair, the owner in the chair, at any one point in time decides the rules of the Premier League. And the Premier League is the elite league in England. It's very important. and it just depends who's in the chair at any one time. I find that completely nonsensical. The idea that these people who are in situ decide the rules of the game for English football, it just feels wrong. I think they shouldn't have a say. And we've talked about self-interest. And one classic example is this. There was a vote on associate party transactions, i.e. buying stuff from yourself, and the issue of things like hotels. They ended up not either voting on it or voting to keep that in place. And the reason they kept it in place is that the people who were really annoyed by, say, Chelsea doing it, their level of self-interest was so high, hang on, maybe one day that's a ripcord we could pull for ourselves. That surely is not the way English football should be run.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I can't believe we're going to say some of these things, given we're supposed to be kind of a maybe more energetic podcast, but it's an argument for the independent regulator. For all the Premier League complains about it, if the Premier League is basically only governing through the kind of the self-interest through votes, then yes, this is an argument to step in because of the effect it has on everything else. It's remarkable.
I was going to say, actually, you mentioned the government regulated. The tightening of PSR, now I might be wrong about this, but this appears to be the common view, is that this stuff started getting tightened around the time of the government regulator being floated by the Tory government, and also by another couple of things. Newcastle's, obviously, interest from the Saudi Arabian Public Investment Fund, and then, of course, the Super League. All these factors collided, and suddenly we arrive at this state where PSR is the three letters on everyone's lips in football.
But that's exactly it as well. Sorry, I mean, because what you've described there, and it's that sort of period around 21 to 2022, and it's not a coincidence that comes straight after COVID and all the financial stress that put in the game. I mean, what is that except basically a number of factors that have built up in football, essentially since the millennium, a little bit further in some cases, that are suddenly all crashing together, and because the game couldn't withstand them anymore, they had to have this effect, and I think that's exactly what happened, and it's why then there becomes such focus on something like PSR, because it becomes one of those issues where it looks like it distills all of this at once.
Yeah, and it's we're talking about PSR within our English Premier League and then the EFL, and I think Wilson the other day when we did the Championship discussion, he talked about the fact that all these rules, they don't fit in isolation, and football is so dynamic, and suddenly you overlay an international dimension with European football, say. So you've got the top of the Premier League, these teams that are trying to either play in the Champions League, competing at a higher level, trying to outspend not only the teams in their own league, but then overseas. And you've got rules clashing into each other. And I remember having this conversation about a decade ago. It was around the Champions League draw. It used to take place, still it does again now, in Monte Carlo. UEFA hosts, it's called the European season kickoff, and you have the draw for the Champions League, and sort of everyone arrives for this thing. And I arrived at the airport in Nice, and a Premier League chief executive happened to arrive at the same time and offered me a lift. I said, sure, it's nice car. Sure, why not? And he said something that was, I could see where he was coming from, but also see what you guys make of this, actually. And it was about, look, the Champions League gives us a quarter of our revenue, if not more. You name me another business, this person said, where you wouldn't know if you're going to make or not make a quarter of your revenue the year after, i.e. that massive chunk of money from the Champions League, which is now, more than 100 million euros, right, for the best teams. And he said that is why he was trying to make a case for a kind of a Super League or fixed positions for some of these teams in competitions like this. Now, I looked at him and I was like, well, mate, that's your planning. Yeah. You can't just because you're in the Champions, you basically sort your contracts out. The idea that you now are demanding this payment year after year just because you're in it, and you're finding it hard to balance your books. I just found that as an anecdote a really hard thing for myself to comprehend. I could see a businessman speaking, looking at his balance sheet, but again, this tension between football and business, it was really, I was like, mate, just have your contracts written in a certain way that you don't have to pay out all of this money. But yeah, what do you guys think of that?
I was going to say, for Tariq, maybe you should try and work in freelance journalism, where a quarter of your income will drop off at any point, in fact. Or sales or anything like that. I mean, it doesn't seem that crazy an example to me. Business goes up and down, and as you say, you have to plan for that.
But also, that story, actually, it articulates a central tension in all this, which is that when people complain about PSR, the complaint isn't really about PSR, it's about the system. And that system where basically it's this constant concentration of wealth. I mean, why are we in a situation that the Champions League gives out so much money that's actually disruptive to budgets and consequently disruptive to competitive balance? Well, it's because basically, and this is where, say, we're not willing to indulge the kind of the name, the whole red cartel argument. Or really, it's the super club argument. They specifically wanted this system. So, and they wanted a system, say, where in the 2021-22 season, the 2020-21 season, where both Chelsea and Leicester were going for Champions League in the last day. It was Tuchel's Chelsea, and Chelsea were also in the Champions League final. So had Leicester qualified for that in that season, they would have been guaranteed, because of the Champions League regulations at the time, they would have been guaranteed just 1.5 million euro. Whereas Chelsea would have been guaranteed, and Chelsea did qualify, at least 30 million euro. I mean, that system is absurd. That is the real problem here, not PSR, which is just a financial control. But of course, if you start to get into this idea of kind of, redistribution of wealth, and I think crucially redistribution of talent, that's a lot harder to have and is necessarily a lot less based on self-interest than one that's about PSR. I mean, the owners of Newcastle or whoever, they don't really want to get into that sort of chat because, again, all of football is governed by self-interest.
Should we take a break there? And after the break, we will try to further moisten this driest of dry subjects. We are back here at the Libero podcast, and we're going to continue to talk about financial fair play and PSR. And Miguel and Tariq are still here. Now, one of the arguments made from it is, let's put it straight, the Manchester City argument in particular is that they look across town and they see the club, that they're great rivals, and they see that club is, at various points, £1 billion, dollars, or whatever, in debt. Yet their owners have not put the club into any debt at all. They've financed it themselves. Is that better or worse for football? That's the argument.
Well, I mean, as an opening principle there, I mean, there's an obvious logic to the fact that leveraged buyouts shouldn't have been allowed to exist in football in the first place. Yeah, I mean, even so, we shouldn't even have really got to this point. I think that's absolutely key. Now, I suppose, look, when FFP was crafted, I know from within the Chelsea hierarchy at the time, they were asking questions about why is this sort of spending bad, but then you're allowing the debt that kind of Manchester United or Real Madrid have. I know people will make all sorts of claims there about the influence of such clubs. I suppose some of it is about whether you can service the debt, which is key. I mean, not all debt is bad, is one of the arguments I've heard within this. But again, I would come back to, and it's how so many of these topics that you mentioned, John, like the 2021-22 topics are interlinked, in that ultimately you can't attach, say, this argument of whether debt should be included from an argument about ownership in football and who can own clubs. I mean, it's actually, it is a tangent, obviously, but it is one of the great tragedies of modern football that Manchester United, this club that hadn't had debt since the 1930s, were allowed to be bought in this way.
Wasn't it the case though that when the Chelsea accounts did escape, Roman Abramovich, it was like a personal loan to him, wasn't it? And it was that his debt, the Chelsea's debt to him, just increased, so that when it was sold and this is this money that's floating somewhere and was supposed to go to causes related to the Ukraine-Russia war and is still not resolved as an issue. And there's been other issues about this, hasn't there? As part of the continuing wrangles at the Premier League between the clubs, these things about related parties and also shareholder funding as well. So Arsenal's owners have put money in, and the best example of this is Tony Bloom at Brighton. Now, Tony Bloom, when I was at Brighton at the weekend, is held as the absolute paragon of owners, isn't he? But the club owes money to Tony Bloom, and he's prepared to write it off. He's quite happy with that. And he's like almost at the last of the local heroes. This tradition of the local man made good that finances the club. Matthew Benham will be another example. But it's funny, isn't it? Those that own that are the Manchester Cities, maybe the Aston Villas, maybe the Newcastles, don't like the example that someone like Tony Bloom sets. I mean, this is one of the issues at the heart of PSR. It's not. There isn't a right answer to it, is there?
It gets quite complicated because one of the things with Manchester City, obviously, Man City's big case is now in its 8th year, is it? And
yes.
That also is an indictment on the Premier League. This team has won 4 league championships at least, I think. A bunch of other things without a ruling. That can't be nice for their fans either. The fact that you're accused of all of these things. We write about it all of these for all this time and without a resolution. And that's another thing that the Premier League needs to be clear about. There's a Chelsea case ongoing as well, don't forget. Almost the entire Roman Abramovich period is now under scrutiny. But with us not knowing anything beyond a few tidbits we might find out or colleagues might find out, this isn't the way this should work. But in terms of Man City and APT, Man City were right here. They kind of threw the kitchen sink at the Premier League's rules, and point last year they won a victory, and I think it was clear. These are about the soft loans, the loans from shareholders, which is a related party to the clubs at interest rates below market value. But the reason why that was allowed is Man City sat along with the other 20 clubs in the Premier League at that time, voted for them not to be part of the APT rules. They were there, and then had a legal challenge. So it just shows like the mess of what this thing is. And one of the things with Man City, they've got another legal challenge right now. Man City and the Premier League are, you can't make some of this up. The best team in the last 10, 15 years is at war with the league itself, the league it plays in. And there's a new APT challenge, which is ongoing, which means the new rules, which we haven't discussed thus far, there were going to be new rules, which were going to be a mix of something called anchoring, which means that the top club can spend a factor of what the bottom club can, essentially. So it can't completely go, over its skis and spend, 50 times more than the last team. I think it was something like 4 or 5 times. That's what they were going to anchor it at. And there was going to be something called squad cost rules, i.e. like UEFA's, you spend 70% or 75% of your revenue on transfers. But because Man City have this ongoing appeal, all of that is now on the back burner, and we're stuck with this messy PSR system.
Yeah, just there is a point to be made on associated party transactions as well. In that, obviously, someone put to me that has worked extensively in this. There's a bit of an absurdity to them in the sense that, like, all they really are, in some degree, is essentially it's owner funding, but just with a different company in the middle of it. That it should be viewed as equity, because if it's ultimately the same ownership, that the money is coming from the same pot, and obviously that kind of has a different level of complication in autocratic states where there are all sorts of blurred lines between the private and the state, and even if there aren't necessarily blurred lines, well, the state has such power that they can make those lines blurred. But yeah, and that was always the point that was put to me, in the sense that really associated party transaction shouldn't exist at all in that form, because it is ultimately coming from the same pot of money. But again, it's just another kind of complication that the strange world of football is in has thrown up.
It's funny, isn't it, when these rulings come from independent bodies or whatever. We're always in this situation where both sides claim some kind of victory. I mean, some of it is the clubs will release a statement, the Premier League will release a bit more of a terse statement, but there'll be back channels that will tell you that actually that we did achieve something of a victory here or something. And it's confusing, and you can get briefing from both sides, and of course you've got that that tranche of expert opinion that's out there. You've got those that will willfully act in the interests of bigger clubs for whatever reason, because they've fallen on one side of the argument. It's a confusing picture. If you're a football fan, I mean, Miguel speaks like a man who is fully abreast of accounting terms and so on, and we've known each other a long time. But I don't think when we met Miguel, you were across all these terms. I really don't, and I'm very impressed. I mean, you've written a book about it and all the rest of it, but you all over it. And Tariq, similarly, we've known each other a similar amount of time, but Tariq was always abreast of those.
Tariq for Bloomberg.
Yeah, that's the thing.
I had to. I was forced to.
Yeah, but that's it. I mean, you worked for a business publication, didn't you, for many years at Bloomberg, and that the sports business is such a big thing, and yet at the heart of it is just this big battle and this dispute, and it's chanted in the terraces, and I heard it on the train back from Brighton back to London, and it's all encompassing, isn't it?
It is. It creates this, passionate fervour behind an accountant or a lawyer. I mean, the idea that at Man City there was the banner for QC, for example. It is mad where we've ended up, but it kind of fuels the tribalism, and you've mentioned it, I think, a couple of times, and I think it's worth reiterating that, because we're living in this social media age. John, you mentioned these surrogates. I often think they know what they're doing, some of these guys, and it's sort of red meat to a fan base. And obviously, every team wants their team to win, and now they are kind of trying to win off the pitch, as it were, as well. And it gets kind of nasty. And the thing is, there's certain people who know exactly what they're doing. They know the rules, but they also are feeding into this social media industry around it, building their own profiles, if you want, through this stuff, and probably profiting through this, if not antagonizing, a bunch of or weaponizing fan bases along the way. And I guess that is the sign of the times, and that's the world we live in. But one of the things that we haven't talked about, I think, is Miguel mentioned Manchester United. He's right. Manchester United should never have been sold in the way they were to the Glazer family, but here we are. It's the people who run football are sleeping on the job, and they always have been. They get caught by surprise. Oh my goodness! Like, what we're going to have to come up with some regulations here now because this thing has happened. But they allow these monsters to grow, and one of those, and you see it now, and it links to this, an associate party transaction in PSR, is the issue of multi-club ownership, for example. Now, how is anyone supposed to keep abreast of this stuff? It's all happening in the dark. As I said at the start, the lack of transparency around this. Now, if we want solutions, one of the things might be, and it's the La Liga, for example. I'm not sure it's perfect, but there is a lot more publicly available information, almost a living balance of what teams can spend and not spend and where they are, and you can see it. The Premier League, none of this is around. It's so opaque, leaving conspiracy theorists, if they want, or upset fans to sort of, shout at the wall about their club being hard done by. And I think the Premier League is partly to blame for this, for not being more clear and upfront about what is happening at any moment in time.
But the Liga example that I think back to, and this is going back a few years, of course, is Girona, the club, associated with Manchester City, and also half owned by Pep Guardiola's brother, Pera. The La Liga went through the list that Girona players and said that had been given this valuation and said, that's not the valuation that we would attach to them. I mean, that was a clear example, and that was a dispute they had. But that was an example of how they do it. I mean, the QC you mentioned, or Casey, I should call him these days, of course, David Panic, is a guy. There was a banner at Eastlands celebrating him. He's the guy that defended Boris Johnson. And also, is it the Garrick Club as well? That he, I mean, the various things. I mean, it's funny that the bedfellows that football has found itself with these days. Miguel.
On that wider point as well, that Tariq made there, I mean, in a world where you've got private equity funds and states who want to obviously maximize their assets, and the very fact that they can rightly be called that is one of the problems of football. I mean, how is football regulation ever supposed to keep up with that? They're always going to be behind. And this is like Scudamores, in the Scudamore era, the whole strategy was to actually be reactive in regulation. And it has essentially to respond to problems as they come up. But, I mean, now that just leaves you. It means, like, as Tariq's raised there with multi-club, it means that you've got a problem that becomes hardwired into the game. By the time people realise they have to do something about it, there's actually nothing that can be done. And hence UEFA are in this absolute mess with the multi-club issue.
The
Scudamore. There's one thing about the PSR which I think we all find fairly regrettable, and there needs to be a quick solution to. But I suspect all the legal battles that we were talking about there are probably going to stop there being a solution. Is this selling off of young players? Because for book value. So Aston Villa have just sold Jacob Ramsey, a player who's hugely popular among Aston Villa fans, local lad. Maybe he wasn't in the team last season as much as he would be, but he's still got a bright future. Would have a bright future at that club. Sold to Newcastle, where he'll be a good player, no doubt about that. But that's regressible, isn't it? This selling the family silver, the community aspect that we talk of. The fact, where would Milan be without a Maldini? Where would Manchester United be without Gary Neville and Paul Scholes or whatever? And Liverpool, hundreds of homegrown players. Steven Gerrard, for example. Steven Gerrard, there's a possibility that the next Steven Gerrard will be sold on because it could, if Liverpool got into problems, because that's the easy solution. What is the solution to that problem? Have you two speaking to people that there is anyone working on this?
I mean, I suppose you can put in certain regulations about attempting to protect academy produced players. There are complications to that, obviously. But I mean, one of the ones that I've thought about a lot and spoken to people in football about that could actually solve a few of these problems at a stroke is some sort of basically regulation, not on redistribution of wealth, but on redistribution of talent. So, like, I was speaking to someone who used to work in UEFA who was saying, if you had the old foreign player rule, it actually immediately solves all these problems at a stroke, because that was obviously kind of, you could play 3 foreign players and 2 assimilated players that have been in a country for a certain amount of time. Because as soon as that comes in, it means obviously one club, say, who have all sorts of money, they can't just buy players. I have no need to buy players in the same way because they obviously have to fit a certain criteria. So that starts to spread talent around the game. Great players, say, leave Croatia that bit later, strengthening the Croatian league. It's a gradual kind of leveling out of the sport. Now, you can't obviously bring back the foreign player rule because it's against EU law in terms of labour rights. What you can do is actually, and maybe to bring it full circle, maybe, is do what they did with kind of FFP and salary caps and do it indirectly. So what can you have a situation where basically a certain amount of your players have to be homegrown, not just in the squad, but actually in your starting lineup? Why not?
Agree. Yeah, absolutely. Why not? And John, exactly this, that when you're a football fan, and this is a sport, and this is our business, but we'd rather not talk about this, if I'm honest with you. Like, we're forced to do this because it's part of what we do now. When a young player has come through the academy and is in the team, and has a career at that team, that person and the connection with him and his public, the supporters, is going to be so much stronger than whether you're going to drop £150 million on a centre forward from somewhere. And as exciting as that might be, the fact that this 6-year-old, 8-year-old, 12-year-old has now made it, they might become the team captain. We've seen not just Steven Gerrard, John Terry at Chelsea, etc. Now, how popular he was there. If you're there may be, it might be different for match-going fans and people watching on TV far away, but that connection to the club, to the place, to the academy, that should be what the people who are responsible for the game would want to promote. The idea now that is, a tool in your armory when you're trying to get round PSR regulations is fundamentally ridiculous. And the fact this has been happening for at least now 2-3 seasons and nothing has happened is a joke. The league should be doing something about this. The teams should want to do something about this. And then you have this situation where now, 8-year-olds are being signed by clubs. I'm hearing about money being exchanged. This is all against the rules, but no one is catching up with this. Academies are being stuffed full of players and being poached from elsewhere, probably with the hope of not really putting them in the first team, but using them as assets to trade and sell further down the line. That really, really isn't what football is supposed to be for. And then, look, these owners, whether it's the Guggenheim guys at Chelsea or whether it's other private equity funds, they are better than anybody else at doing financial engineering. So they will beat you at financial rules. Every time you put a rule in, they're going to be better than you. So guess what? You are football people. You might want to have some football rules, things that you understand maybe better than anyone else, and keep them simple. So a couple of things I thought about was, why not stop the amount of trading of players? Why not have a cap on the number of new registrations you can have per 1 year or per 3 years? If you want to plan ahead, you can have 10 trades or whatever you want. Have something like that. Why not cap the number of professional contracts you have at any one time to stop hoarding? That's very clear and kind of obvious, and stops us having to get into a maze of weird financial rules that we're scratching our heads around. And accountants listening to this will probably be thinking, well, they didn't get that right. They didn't get that right. Of course we didn't get that right. We're football journalists. And it shouldn't be this complicated, should it, guys?
No. Well, I hope that we've managed to uncomplicate it in some form. And Miguel in particular's accountancy has improved. A plus from me, wouldn't you say there, Tariq?
Well, I wasn't great in school accountancy. Much like kind of your language base.
I always think
I'll give him the A plus for the French as well.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I always think that those topics are probably for the more mature student. I think learning economics at 16 very difficult. I felt anyway. Yes. So thank you, Tariq. Thank you, Miguel, for joining us on Libero. And to the listeners, thank you for joining us. Thank you to producer Tom. And further instructions to like and subscribe on Spotify, Apple. But bye for now.
Powered by Riverside.